Welcome to the Back40 Leadership Podcast, Season 2, Episode 4. My name is Michael Bond, and I will be one of your hosts today. I'm sitting here with Pastors Mel Massengale and Todd Stanley.
Hello, hello.
Greetings.
So real quick.
That's the best I can do. That's all I got. Greetings.
Salutations.
That's a good one. So real quick, before we jump in, I want to invite you to give this podcast a 5-star rating and write us a review. We're
only
on Apple.
5-star
Only
ratings.
5-star, please.
That's right.
If you give us below a 5-star, I will be contacting you and we'll ask you about that. We are on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts, we're there. Also, share this on social media and tell your friends about it. Remember to subscribe at summitpodcasts.church /subscribe. This is the network where all of our Summit podcasts are distributed. Subscribing will allow you to receive email notifications every time we release new content here at Summit Church. Today, we are going to discuss leadership development in a rural setting. So a couple questions we might talk about are, how do you identify people with high kingdom potential? How do you build human resources with a smaller talent pool? And what should the process look like once a high kingdom potential person has been identified? All of these questions and more are coming up, but first is This Week in Church Leadership.
It feels like we should have some sort of like audio bumper for that.
Yeah.
Something.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
We could put something, maybe like Darth Vader music, or
We can fix that in post.
yeah.
Well,
So Todd, you want to go first with this
I
week?
can go first. So here's an article I found. A Mississippi Baptist church has become the first Southern Baptist church to accept cryptocurrency for donations and tithes. So apparently Back Bay Baptist Church in St. Martin's, Mississippi, announced at the end of September that they were going to start accepting digital currencies after COVID-19 made it difficult to collect traditional payments. I don't honestly know enough about cryptos to really speak intelligently about this, but what do you guys think?
I knew it was coming at some point, right? It feels inevitable that more people in our churches are going to be interested in this stuff and want to know how to give that way and things like that. But
Yeah. I can't decide whether or not cryptocurrency is going to become a superior currency. So it does seem like it has some attributes to it. Like, for instance, it doesn't respect the borders of sovereign nations. So it's worth the same no matter where you are in the world. So that prevents countries from doing certain things like currency manipulation and devaluing their currency, and currency that is specific to a particular country. Those are weaknesses that those types of currencies would have, and cryptocurrency doesn't have that. It's also very hard to fake. It's very hard to, what's the term? I'm missing the
Counterfeit?
term. Counterfeit. Yeah, counterfeit. And I think the reason is because, and I don't know the nuts and bolts behind this, but I think that each Bitcoin has its own digital DNA, so to speak. And so it's permanent. It can't be deleted and it can't be replicated. And so you can't add to it. And so those might be reasons why that's the wave of the future. And if that's the wave of the future, I think churches should definitely get on board with it. They don't want to miss that train.
Well, it feels like we're talking more about cryptocurrency instead of the church aspect. But I will say this, some cryptocurrency the theory is that it's inflation proof because you can't just make more of it. Now there's quite a bit of cryptocurrency that they can just produce more of whenever. And so that would defeat that argument. But I know, with Bitcoin, for instance, there are so many Bitcoin in the world. There's so many Bitcoin that will ever be in the world, and that's it. It's fixed. And so it feels like it's less prone to all of a sudden the valuation just dropping, other than the fact that people just agree that the valuation's not there anymore. So the day that everybody just goes, yeah, this is fake money, it's not real, it's monopoly money, that's when the bottom could drop out of the market on that. But as far as churches receiving it and accepting it, I don't see why they shouldn't. I think that's smart. If somebody donated Bitcoin to us, I would not sit on it and hope that it would go up. That feels risky. I would cash it in and leverage it for kingdom purposes, let's go. But yeah, I think it's great. Why not?
Well, so to maybe kind of get back to church leadership in regard to this. So my question would be, because I think that it's inevitable that there will be people in the church who, want to talk about comparisons with the mark of the beast, that think that it's, that because there's a lack of understanding about it, it could. So how do you lead well in regard to those kinds of things? I don't know that it's much different than other technologies that have come prior, but what should pastors do in that regard?
So I think that it's probably runs through the same vein as like theology surrounding vaccinations and things like that. Like I think that there's probably always, in each generation, there's going to be mountains made out of molehills, and there's going to be misunderstandings among congregations that need to be addressed and need to be sorted through. And that might be one of those things. I think that one reason why churches might want to adopt cryptocurrency that would fall in line more with church leadership than the currency itself is that we don't know if banks are going to start monitoring bank accounts and deciding ethics behind what people and organizations purchase. And if for instance, Visa says, okay, we're going to start monitoring bank accounts, and if you make purchases that we deem to be hateful, we're shutting down your account.
Yeah.
And something like that would be much more difficult to do if the church was operating on cryptocurrency. And so it might even play into that issue, Todd, of like, there might be a lot of skepticism surrounding it at first among congregations until they see the need for it. Like if they start believing or seeing that their bank accounts with US dollars are being monitored or, by people that they don't want monitoring them, and they see, okay, this is a way out of that, then maybe they would be less hesitant and less resistant to adopting that new wave of currency.
Well, and you bring up an interesting point. I read an article just a couple of days ago that Venmo is now reporting all transactions to the IRS. So if you're just transferring money friend to friend, but if there's an exchange of goods and services, they're reporting all those transactions to the IRS so that they're being taxed now. So the IRS is sending you a 1099 if you generate more than $600 from that. So it's like they know. And so, I think the world we live in and the world we're heading toward is a world that you kind of referred to, that it's like, okay, yeah, we don't like that you're giving to a hate group. And a hate group could be something like a church that speaks out against, LGBTQ issues or, and so yeah, that's an interesting point you bring up.
Yeah. So the next article that I had here was one from Kerry Newhoff's blog, and he was talking about new metrics for church growth.
Friend of Back40.
That's
Kerry
right.
Newhoff.
Yeah. As a side note, and I'm not proud of this, by the way, he put out an article, and one of our pastors here, Kendall, pointed out to me that this article outlined like 7 or 8 dimensions along which you can identify a bad leader, and he told me that I fit 7 of them. And so I was
not all 8.
Not all 8. I think that I got
them with kindness.
I think I got out of the 8th one on a technicality. So the conversation is going to continue on that.
That's good to know.
So anyway, this blog post on new metrics for church growth, he identifies 4 of them. And so what I'll do is I'll just list the 4 of them and summarize them quickly, and then we can talk about the value of following these or not following these. The first one is what he calls budget pie. And this is how much of church income is being spent on benevolence projects that directly impact the community. And the idea being that where you spend your money reveals what you value. So we can just start with that one. What do you think about like looking more at where the money is going back out versus how much money is coming in?
Yeah. Well, and I think that makes a lot of sense. And I talk to pastors about that. If you, the simplest way for you to start to turn your church around is change the focus from inward to outward. And that's one of the common denominators among every church that's shrinking and struggling, is that a lot of times their focus is inward. So it's like, well, if you want to have an outward focus, start giving, start looking toward the needs of your community. And so I think that's an easy way to measure that, is to go, okay, hey, we were spending 1% of our budget on things that were going on outside of our church, reaching people, serving people, blessing people, whatever. But now we're spending 12% of our budget. And it's like, okay, that's measurable. And it might not translate into butts in the seats, but it's going to translate into impact in the kingdom. And so, and I would say it's not just money that you're saying, okay, we're going to pay this family's gas bill. That's benevolence. But we even count, Steph McCoy is our missions and outreach pastor, and we count a pretty significant portion of her salary and benefits toward what we do for outreach, because most of her job is, how do we reach people who are not part of our church, who don't sit in the pews, who don't, and so it's not just purely benevolence dollars. It's, hey, what kind of energy are we leveraging toward, those kind of things. So yeah, I like that a lot.
The second one is engagement rates. So this would be over against attendance rates. And the engagement rate measures how many people are getting involved in projects which are core to the church's vision over against simply attending. And so the idea being that you look at people who are coming to church and ask, okay, are they just coming to church, or are they serving? Are they getting involved? And I think this one's pretty standard for a lot of churches to look at. But can you talk a little bit about the benefit of looking at engagement rates instead of looking at attendance rates? Because you might have a really high attendance and have a really low engagement rate. And do you think that there are some pastors who would look at that and be like, well, as long as my attendance stays up, I'm safe, I'm okay, and maybe not lend as much weight to the engagement rates?
For sure. I mean, I think it's tempting for any of us to look at, the number of people gathered on a weekend, if the giving is, healthy, that kind of thing. It's easy for us to look at those things and feel a certain amount of security in that, right? Mm-hmm. And so then we lose sight of, well, are these people growing to know Jesus? Are these people engaged in the mission of the kingdom of God? Which is a way more critical question than whether or not they show up on the weekend. And so, I think it's easy for us to lose sight of those things. We have to always keep that in the forefront of the conversation. The whole Simon Sinek, start with why thing. We have to ask why we exist, and then ask how that's impacting the people that we serve.
Yeah, and I think it's if the real metric we're looking at is weekend attendance, then we are little more than event, production directors. You know what I mean? We are just producing an event and people are showing up. And so if we're not engaging people in the mission and vision of God, then that's a problem. And I think we've been lulled into this where that's what we measure. We measure dollars and humans, noses and nickels, as some people say. But really, I think engagement is important. And I think any church could measure engagement. We just don't always want to, because we can look at, okay, how many people are serving? How many people are in, some sort of discipleship track? How many people are in a new believer track? Whatever it is, how many people are engaged in those things? And that'll give you an idea to some degree or another. And at our church too, we look at giving, not just in terms of the overall dollars, but hey, are people giving? Because that is a measure of discipleship to some degree, because it's not a generosity issue in churches, it's a discipleship issue. So are people engaged in giving regularly and growing in that? And if they are, then that probably means they're growing in their faith. So I think there's lots of ways we can measure engagement. If you're willing to look at your metrics and look at the different things you're doing, you can figure out, hey, how are we doing as far as engagement goes?
Yeah, and I don't think it's either or. I mean, you want to be attracting as many people as possible. There's nothing wrong with that, right? But if that becomes the end all be all, then you've lost sight of the real goal.
Yeah, and I think the traction part leads to number 3 on the list too, if you want to.
Oh, yeah. So the third one is integration rates.
Yeah.
And this is something, Pastor Mel, that you might want to talk about, the 3 points that you share with us in the pre-service meetings every weekend now. Yeah. The idea being that how many people are building new relationships with each other through the church, and are these relationships leading to deeper involvement in the core projects?
Yeah. So in our pre-service meeting every weekend, and this isn't original to me, I didn't make this up. I'm not that smart, but a friend of mine pastors a large church in Texas, and he's worth a follow. His name's Josh Howerton. Josh shared this one time, and I loved it. But basically, I share these three things with our team in pre-service meeting. And a solo person in our gathering is an emergency. So if we see somebody who's by themselves, sitting alone, walking through the lobby alone, that's a problem. We need to set aside whatever we're doing and go engage them, connect them, get to know them, because there's a chance they're new. And that's even more important because a new alone person is definitely a problem.
Yeah.
So we want to get to know them. The second thing we say is friends can wait. So what we tend to do is huddle with our friends and, I don't get to see them very often, but it's like, yeah, but that's more about you. Connecting to a new person's more about the kingdom. It's more about how do we integrate? How do we connect them to opportunities? And then the third thing is connect them to somebody else. Connect somebody you meet to somebody else. So it might be something like you meet them, you find out that they're a veteran. This was a situation with me a few weeks ago. I met somebody, found out they were a veteran. I was like, man, I would love to introduce you to Vanessa. She and her husband are both veterans. She's on our team. Dave leads our security team. I'd love to introduce you to these guys. And it was just an opportunity to connect them deeper in a more organic way to our church. And it was like, I didn't send them through Growth Track or, it was more about, I want to connect you relationally.
Yeah.
And those are the things that actually get people into Growth Track and into, those other things. So.
Yeah, it's really good because it builds instant familiarity. So if someone makes a friend at church on their first day at church, well, the second time at church, they have someone there now.
Yeah.
And so it's even easier for them to come back and to get more involved, and it provides community and all those things. And I think that one of the wisdom behind reminding us, before each service to do this is because it's one of those things that because we live in godly community all the time, it can seem like a given. It can seem like that's just the way it is. And then we can forget to sort of go out of our way, or we can become so duty driven that, we're thinking about, okay, I need to check all these boxes. And so we miss the relational element of it. And, and it's not like the pastors here are new pastors, they're experienced pastors, but it still bears reminding, that constant sort of reminder it's almost like a training to make that part of a habit. And I think that's really good.
Well, and even for me, I would say, I was having a conversation this last weekend in our lobby, and it was somebody that's been around a while and that I know, and it wasn't a deep, meaningful conversation. And I saw somebody that was alone, and that, I say it, but it went through my head. Hey, friends can wait. And so I said, hey, would you give me 1 minute? There's somebody over here I haven't met. Oh, sure. No problem. And your friends are going to give you grace. And so I did, I went over and had that conversation. And so it was a good reminder, even for me, like I'm the one saying it, but I needed to be reminded of it too.
Yeah. So the fourth metric is community feedback. And so the idea here is, does the community agree with your own in-house evaluation of how you are benefiting the community? So like every church probably would like to think that they're benefiting the community, but does the community agree with that evaluation?
I don't know that I have a take on that. I mean, I think it's definitely a good idea. I mean, if you ask somebody in your community, how do you feel like our church is a benefit to our community? And they go, what church? Right. I mean, that's a problem, and so
I've never heard of that church before.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, we need to know for us, for example, I feel like if the people who live in Indiana, whether they attend Summit Church or not, if they're, and obviously you're not going to get 100% across the board for this, but I want people to be able to say, this city is better because Summit Church is here.
Yeah.
And the only way you find that out is to ask. The only way you find that out is to be engaged with the people of your community, find out what their needs are, and do what you can to try and meet those felt needs. And if you're not doing that in a tangible way, then when people come up against a crisis, or when they start to feel the spiritual need that they that was attached to a felt need. Does that make sense? Like
Yeah.
when those things start to happen, you're not going to be the one they ask. You're not going to be the one they come to.
Yeah.
And so if you're not being of a benefit to your community in a like a practical way, they're not going to come to you for their spiritual need either, because they don't believe you care.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's good. And I would say if you have to ask, that's
probably not doing it.
That's probably a problem. Yeah. If you have to ask the question, hey, would anybody notice if we disappeared? Because we know it, because people tell us, we're engaged enough in the community. We hear from police officers. We hear from teachers. We hear from people that we are intentionally reaching going, oh my gosh, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Like, man, this makes a difference. So we hear that pretty regularly. But one of the things, and I think any pastor can do this, and maybe it's not the pastor, because especially if you're in a small town, you might not be able to get away with it, but have somebody. And I do this whenever I go to another church. If they've asked me to come in and speak, or if they've asked me to come in and do some coaching, I will always stop in gas stations in town and I'll ask them, hey, tell me what you think about South Point. Have you ever heard of South Point Church? Oh yeah, is that the church over? Yeah. What do you know about that? I'm going over there today. Do you know anything about it? And just ask them questions, and they'll tell you. If you don't know what your vision is and what your mission is, I bet you can ask some people in your community, and they'll tell you what it actually is. And so that's a good exercise to do. And so maybe a pastor could ask somebody in their church, hey, just ask. When you go into Walmart, ask somebody, hey, do you know anything about this church? What do you know? What do you think? And you're going to get some feedback, and you might hate the feedback, but you'll never be able to shift if you don't know what the feedback is. So I like that. I like that a lot.
Well, and I think too, and maybe this is a parallel issue, but it is possible and necessary, I would say, for people who may be on the other side of the fence from you to know and believe that you care about the community that they live in and you care about them. We're in a climate where like it doesn't feel like we care much for the people we disagree with, and I just don't think there's a place for that in the church.
Yeah. I've got a friend that they will, from time to time, they will pay people that don't go to their church to come to their church and be a secret shopper. And they'll give them a list of criteria. Hey, here's what I want you to judge your experience based on. I'll give you $100 if you'll just show up, and maybe it'd be $50 or a gift card or something like that. But if you really want to know what the feedback is from an outsider, that would be simple to do.
Yeah.
But yeah, that stuff's dangerous, because then we hear the truth and we don't always want to. We can't handle the truth. So
I actually presented an idea to a church once, and they did not like it, of having like regular, what I called listening sessions. So I suggested that they do it every Monday, just every Monday evening, the pastor's there, and the whole goal of the evening is for people to come in and ask questions, and the pastor to listen to what the people who showed up had to say. And immediately the concern was, well, how is that not going to devolve into a vicious argument, or amongst people who have different opinions and all this. And my aim on it, or perspective on it, was, well, that would be good if that happened, because then the pastor could demonstrate how to show truth and love, and how to have a good faith conversation with people who disagree with each other. Like, let's not be afraid of conflict or the difficult conversation. Let's take advantage of the opportunity to show how to have a healthy, difficult conversation. And if you open that up in the form of something like a listening session, then, I can't see how that would be anything but good. But do you guys see any obvious issues with that?
Not necessarily. Yes, in an ideal world, that would be good. But I think, if we're going to be honest, I think a lot of people don't know how to defend their position. They feel it, but they can't articulate it. They can't. And if we're going to be honest, there's a whole bunch of people who go to our church, and I know it's like this for other churches as well, that they couldn't have an intelligent conversation about doctrine. Okay, let's talk about doctrine. Let's talk about, our core beliefs and our biblical beliefs. A lot of people couldn't. They just know, I like this church because I feel good. And so that's what their arguments are. That's where their engagement lies whenever they start talking to people about things like that. It's all about feeling, and that's the problem, in my opinion.
Yeah, that and public forums of any kind, whether it's religious or not, tend to devolve into conflict or screaming matches or one-upsmanship and that's difficult to avoid in those kinds of settings. I tend to think that you can accomplish that same kind of listening strategy in one-on-one conversations, but you have to be engaging people who aren't part of your church. And if you're not doing that, then we have to ask ourselves, are we engaged in making disciples? Yeah. Are we engaged in reaching people who don't know Jesus? Because if I'm not having conversation with people who aren't part of my church, well, then I'm not modeling what I'm telling my people they need to be doing.
Yeah. Well, and something, we had Gerald Brooks with us recently at Summit, and he's another friend of Back40, but Gerald, one of the things he said was
to honk every time we
friend of Back40. Yeah. So one of the things Gerald said is the quickest way to build a church is to be mad at what other people are mad at.
Yeah.
And that's the world we live in, where I've got people that leave our church all the time because I'm not mad enough at the things they're mad at. They want me to take a very public stance on things that it's like, well, this is extra biblical. Like this isn't core to who we are or what we're trying to do in people's lives. So could we have a conversation about critical race theory in church? Yeah. Is that going to be helpful to establishing the gospel and to moving people's hearts? And no, but what it's going to do is it's going to help people who have the same position that I espouse to go, yeah, that's right. And all it's going to do is polarize and move people away from gospel. But what we're going to do is we're going to have more people that are rallied around something that is not even central to the gospel. And so those are some of the things that I think we get into whenever we start having moments like that. And so when you talk about having the one-on-one conversations, that's where that becomes really valuable, because we sit down and we talk through that stuff, and we're not just a soundbite at that point. We're not just, we can see the nuance, because most issues, there's a lot of nuance to it. And so like when in listening, what you're just describing, you could have a conversation with nuance, but the problem is maybe the forum is more public than private.
Right.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. Just a couple quick things, and I think we probably need to move on. But, in regard to that, like, number one, as I was, just as Mel was talking, I was thinking, okay, the only thing I think, in Scripture, the only thing we see Jesus angry about, two things, I guess. He's angry about sin, right? God's angry about sin. But then Jesus in particular is angry at the religious people, right? And so when we start to turn our attention to what honestly may not even be peripheral issues and get off the centrality of the gospel, then we get into the weeds and the gospel gets lost. Man, if there's anything that in any time that we've needed to make sure that we are focusing on the good news of Jesus, it's in the climate we live in now. And I just don't have time for that other stuff. It's not that I don't want to have a conversation about it. I won't, I'll be glad to share with people if they want to talk one-on-one, that kind of thing. But I don't have any time for that in regard to what we do as a church.
I think I could probably push back on that a little bit, but I'm not going to, because we used up a good bit of time on that. We can maybe save that for a different...
We can have a conversation one-on-one, Michael. That'd be great.
Perfect.
We're not going to do a listening session is what you're saying. So.
Okay, so let's talk about leadership development, and maybe let's talk about it from like a rural perspective. How can pastors in a rural setting identify people with high kingdom potential? So let's just start with that question. Say you don't have a massive talent pool to choose from. Say you don't have a major prosperous city to attract talent, those sorts of things. What would you do? What would be step one in pastoring a smaller church in terms of finding somebody who has high kingdom potential?
So can we define kingdom potential?
Yeah, maybe somebody who's humble and teachable, somebody who has a servant's heart. I think that's probably the core beginnings of kingdom potential, someone who has a calling on their life. So I wouldn't say that it's somebody who has to have perfect, well-developed theology right out of the gate, or somebody who is an excellent performer in terms of music or whatever it is. I think they would probably have to have humility. They'd have to be teachable. They'd have to have a calling on their life. Those kind of intangibles which make up a servant would be I would call that the ground level of high kingdom potential. And then the other stuff can be trained and cultivated by people who are masters of their craft.
Okay.
I would probably start with this. We very rarely will people who are people have greater kingdom potential, to use that language, than we do attracted to our ministry. So if I'm a level 7 leader, very few level 10 leaders are going to be attracted to me to follow me. So one of the very first things I would tell leaders to do is make sure you are stretching yourself and growing yourself. And because you can't control the people around you, you can't control the people who show up, but you can control you. Mm-hmm. And so that's where I would say, really work on your character, really work on your capacity, make sure that you are growing as a leader, because maybe you're a level 4 leader and you're unhappy because you're getting level 3 leaders. Well, what if you become a level 6 leader, right? So that's the first thing I would say is grow your leadership, because you can control that, but you can't control some of the other things.
Mm-hmm. So when you're drawing people from a smaller talent pool, so this I don't think is an indictment of smaller churches. It's just the fact that the populations are smaller, so there's less people, there's less of a talent pool. Do you change your approach in terms of like how much you're willing to keep someone around, or how much you're willing to invest in someone? How, like, what the standard is in terms of talent? Does that need to change in relation to the talent pool?
I don't think so. I think that we have to be realistic in terms of whether or not someone is going to reach their potential. You know, I mean, I think there has to be a shelf life on that, and not to abandon somebody, or whatever the case may be, but to recognize that, okay, this is their lid, right? It's not going to be fair to them or to your church, or, to continue to invest in somebody who's not going to grow past a certain level. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But I don't think that you can go, okay, well, because my talent pool is smaller, I'm going to continue to invest in this individual or in this thing, even though I feel like we've reached a limit. Well, then you're just spinning your wheels, and there may be another arena or another person that you can begin to invest in. So I don't think you can adjust it just solely based on the size of your organization.
Well, I will say, I think you adjust your expectations at the beginning, because in a smaller town with fewer human resources, it is going to be harder so if you expect, okay, let me give you an example. You guys understand Nashville, churches in Nashville, they're 8 deep at musicians.
Yeah, they don't have a problem attracting musicians.
They've got studio musicians sitting on the bench because they're not good enough to be on stage, right? That is not the case in Indiana, Pennsylvania, or in Shalakta, or in any of these small towns around us.
Right.
So I think what we have to do is adjust the expectations on the front end, that we're not going to have a talent pool like that. And if we think we are, then no one's ever going to be good enough to do ministry with us. So I think we adjust the expectations on the front end and just go, okay, I understand, but I'm still going to have high expectations for what the output is and what we're ultimately going to be, that we invest resources, we do. And I think at some point there is a time, and I don't know if there's a magic level where we go, okay, we're tapped out. I've invested all I can and we're done. But I think that's probably the case for a lot of people, where you go, okay, there's this diminishing return where you're not willing to give what the ministry needs, or you're not able to, and that's okay. So if we develop somebody and the best they're ever going to be is a level 3 leader, great. Then let's maximize them as a level 3 leader wherever that is. And let's stop trying to turn them into a level 5 or whatever it is. But at the same time, we've got to get that started somewhere. And I think it is important to have good expectations and high expectations for anybody who joins a team. Yeah. Did we answer the question you were even asking?
Yeah. So the question was, and it could help that I repeat it just for people listening. The question was, what would you do if you had a smaller talent pool? Do you adjust
Yeah.
your strategy in terms of measuring talent, in terms of investing in people and that sort of thing? Yeah, I think you guys answered that really well. So, okay, so imagine then that someone shows up who has high kingdom potential, and you recognize it, and they're willing and they're ready to go. Tell me what the process looks like, and let's be as specific as possible. Like day one, they show up to church, they want to serve, they want to get involved, maybe even at the highest levels. What does your process look like for developing that person? And just walk me through it as specific as possible. And maybe some of the things you can share also are what pitfalls are there that you would really want to avoid with someone like that?
Are we talking about in our context at Summit, or just in general?
I think maybe we should focus it on
principles across,
maybe general principles that would also apply to a smaller church setting.
So this is going to sound like I'm talking on both sides of my mouth. I think when you encounter somebody who has high kingdom potential, the temptation, because I've been part of small churches and brand new churches, and the temptation is to thrust them into leadership immediately, give them too much too fast.
Yeah.
And so I would strongly caution against that. But the other side of that, the pendulum swings the other way, and you give too slowly.
Right.
Because if somebody is high capacity, in a lot of places we go, oh, hey, we're not going to ask them to serve because they're very busy. But busy people are the people you want serving, because they're the people that are accomplishing stuff, getting stuff done. They're achieving a lot. And so you want to engage that person, but you just want to make sure that they have a good understanding of your culture and what the expectations are and what you see in them and what you desire for them before you just stick them in a Sunday school class or in a room with kids or, so I would say, don't give them too much too fast. If somebody shows up and they've got this history of church after church and dysfunction and challenges with pastors, don't fall in love with talent. Really look for anointing as well and character, and not just like, okay, this person fills a spot for us. Man, they play the guitar. Let's put them on stage. Like, whoa, wait just a minute,
Yeah. And that's what I was thinking as well. Like, when you do begin to give them responsibilities in areas that, I don't want to say are less critical, but potentially less damaging, if that makes sense. Like, don't thrust them into a teaching role right away, because you don't know them well enough yet. You know what I mean? And you don't know if they know, Adam from a hole in the ground or whatever. You don't. There's a trust level that has to be developed there, that has to be grown. And that doesn't mean that you don't give them responsibility. That doesn't mean that you don't begin to utilize them in different areas. But make sure that you're slow in putting them in critical positions that can affect the vision and direction of your church.
Well, and part of that, I think, is I would probably ask that person to grab coffee. Like, if I'm having a conversation with them, and I do this here at Summit even, sometimes the first time I meet somebody, I will say, man, I'd love to get coffee. Would you be interested? And yeah, I would. Okay. Hey, let's set up a time to talk, because then you're going to be able to discern in those conversations, like, oh, okay. Yeah, man, this person would be a great fit. Or, oh my gosh, no, this person's charismatic, but they are not what they appear to be. Yeah. And so, man, let's spend some time with them. Let's get to know them. Let's get to know their heart. Because, man, we can all be charmed by people. And especially if we're in need, if we're going, man, I've got this hole in my ministry, and we see somebody, we might be going, oh my gosh, they're the perfect fit. But once we get to know them, we're going to know, like, oh yeah, no, they're not ready, or man, maybe they are ready. Once you get to know them a little bit, you're like, yeah, they've been presented on a platter from God for us, for this season, for this moment. Right. Yeah. But that's where you've got to figure that out. You can't just put somebody in a position.
So that segues nicely into another question, which is, what is a smart investment strategy for a person who you would want to put in leadership or put in a particular role? And what I mean specifically, like in terms of resources, like how much should a church pour into someone in a way that lends itself to the proper development of that person, but also protects the organization or protects the church. Like, you want to avoid something like a sunk cost fallacy, where it's like, oh, we've dumped so much into this person, I'm just gonna ignore these other things that are really actually pretty threatening because of how much we've dumped into this person. It seems like big churches make this mistake all the time, repeatedly, over and over, in terms of like celebrity pastors and people who can really bring people in. And I think one of the problems with that even is that when a minister becomes powerful enough, he creates incentive structures, and we might have talked about this before, for yes men to surround that person, because just being in orbit of that person builds your resume and increases your salary and all of those things. And so maybe drawing it back to like the smaller church, you have someone who comes in, has high kingdom potential, wants to be a leader, and you have to decide, what do I do with my resources with this person? How would you approach that from a small church setting?
You have any thoughts on that, Todd?
So, I mean, if you're in a small church, when we're talking about resources, we probably aren't, at least initially, talking about financial resources, because they're
piles of cash.
Yeah, they're not there. So the bigger issue, I think, in terms of resources for a small church would be the amount of time and human resource that you invest into that person. And so I think that's a little harder to quantify. But I do think that the key to that is bringing them alongside you and, giving them access to you and gaining access to them, because you're going to get a couple of things out of that. You're going to begin to be able to assess their character and how solid they are. You're going to be able to begin to invest some of your character and your vision and your value and your church's DNA into that person before you set them loose to run something on their own. So bring them alongside you. If there's a new initiative or a new ministry that you feel like you want your church to begin to invest in, but you don't have the human resource to do that, but hey, if I had this person who could work alongside me, I'm not ready to turn them loose yet completely on that thing on their own, but if I could bring them alongside me and have them do a lot of this work while we walk side by side, then I can learn a whole lot about them and push the vision of the church forward at the same time. And then there comes a point at which you go, okay, I feel confident in the investment that I've made. Now I'm going to be able to turn them loose to do this on their own and then replicate that thing all over again.
Mm-hmm. That's good. What would you say is an acceptable level of risk? How much margin should you keep between yourself, your organization, and potential talent or people that you're trying to bring up? Like, do you have a way that you quantify that, or do you just go by intuition? Like, how does that?
For me, this probably is not great, but I do a lot of things based on feel and intuition. I think it's the Holy Spirit, myself, but some people would call it flying by the seat of your pants or whatever. But I think a lot of people, for me, I feel like I have a pretty good ability to judge people. And I've had some swings and misses too, but I don't have a standard rule, but I think I kind of go based on my gut and what I feel, and I put a lot of weight into that personally.
Yeah, I think pray. It is an indictment on us that is often our second choice, right? Mm-hmm. Pray first. Before you ever ask that person to do anything, pray. And pray until you feel like you have a confidence in what you should do. And that's not to say that I don't mean by that you are confident that it's going to work out perfectly, right? But you have a confidence that this is where I feel God is leading me, and I'm going to trust him for the outcome. And then, ask people that are around you. Like if you have leaders in your church that you trust, and there's a new person who has kingdom potential that you want to begin to invest in, ask those leaders to spend some time with that person, give you their impression. It's a fallacy when we think that we've got to move immediately. Now, we don't want to move slowly, We don't want to be lazy, or maybe lazy isn't the right word, but we don't want to be too cautious to the degree that then we're not able to push the vision of the church forward and to, do what God's calling us to do. But it's a fallacy when we think that we've got to be in a rush, because that indicates that we think that God somehow isn't in control of this timetable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and I mean, we're kind of deviating a little bit. I would say incremental change leads to incremental impact. So if you're in a situation where okay, hey, we can take it slow and we don't need to move the world with this decision, that's great. Let's move slow. Let's make incremental changes. But I think there are some times that it's like, nope, we need to make a splash. We need to do something really big. And it's like, all right, it's going to be risky. Mm-hmm. And you're going to make a big change, and it might have a big impact, but it might backfire in a big way as well.
Yeah. So sometimes you just have to accept big risk it's a precondition to entering into a bigger reward.
Yeah.
That's good. Yeah. Well, and I would say too, especially when we're talking about people, there is always risk.
100%.
No matter what your vetting process looks like, there is always risk.
Yeah.
And so if we're going to spend our whole existence being risk averse, then we end up not doing anything. And I'm telling you that from a person who is pretty risk averse. Like I'm not a natural risk taker. I'm fairly cautious and slow about things. But if I let that be the thing that drives my decision-making process as a leader, I'll never get anything done.
Yeah.
And so I know for me, man, I have to go spend some time with Jesus and go, Lord, I am afraid, and I need you to give me wisdom. I need you to give me strength. I need you to, push me out of the nest, maybe, whatever the case may be. But leaders, we just can't be risk averse all the time, or we won't do anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. And so maybe something that pastors might benefit from hearing is that even level 10 leaders, even
mm-hmm.
people who've done everything right, still swing and miss sometimes.
100%. So, and every leader listening to this podcast right now, they all know exactly what that is, because they've all been burned. They all had, maybe you planted your church and there were people in your core team and they sang your praise, and we're going to be here till the day we die, whatever it is. And then
2 months later,
2 months later, they were gone and they were burning you an effigy. Or maybe you're a pastor that you came to a church and the board that brought you in, oh, you're going to be the greatest pastor ever. And 2 years later, the entire board is gone and they've started another church down the road. Whatever it might be. Every one of us have experienced that kind of stuff where we thought it was going to be one way and it turned out some way else, a different way. And so I think for us, we have to be okay with that. We have to be okay with going, hey, sometimes being faithful and doing what God calls us to do means we're going to experience loss.
Yeah.
And that's just part of it. And that is true whether you're at a church of 10 or 10,000. Every leader I talk to has been betrayed and hurt and disappointed and taken risks on people that they shouldn't have. And that's just part of it.
Yeah. And so you shouldn't allow when those things do happen, you shouldn't think that that's necessarily a reflection on your leadership ability, because then you will become risk averse to the point where you're just terrified to make any decisions in the wake of that. Wow, that's good. So, okay, so you get past the point of identification and the initial steps of development, and you start to build confidence in a person. Let's talk about the mentor apprenticeship relationship. So I would say that one thing that would be a mistake is sending someone off to seminary because you don't have enough time to mentor them. And you can push back on that if you think that that's wrong. I think that if you have someone who has high kingdom potential and you have the tools to develop that person, you should mentor that person. And so maybe we can talk about the mentor apprenticeship relationship and what does that look like in a small church context? What does that look like in terms of time spent during the week? How would you approach something like a mentor apprenticeship?
Go ahead.
It comes back to time. It comes back to what you were talking about earlier, Todd, just investing yourself. So it depends on how much they need of you and how much you are able to give. But I think little things like just getting lunch together are big because we tend to focus on formal things like curriculum or what am I going to teach them but I mean, this is a cliche and cliches are cliches for a reason, but like, I really do think that leadership is caught more than it's taught. So the more that I have people around me that see my heart and see how I respond and see how I make decisions, it's less about sitting them down in a classroom and teaching them than it is about like just letting them live life with you. And it's almost as if we've seen models of that in the Bible, but I can't think of any off the top of my head. So, and so I think that's huge. I think that's really important. And I would never say no one should go to seminary, you know, or you should just, because I think everybody's path is a little different, but I don't think seminary is essential for somebody to be able to pastor or do ministry. I think it is about education. Education doesn't necessarily mean you've got, an MDiv. It might mean that you've been educated informally that's not reflected on some sort of, degree plan or, anything like that. So,
let me look. I think it was Dr. Brooks that was talking about education the other day. And said that
friend of the podcast,
Gerald Brooks. That's right. But he was talking about, well, essentially that, and I thought I put it in my notes. I'm bringing up my notes from the session, but I don't see it. But he was talking about how that education, is not the same as gaining knowledge. Like an educated person, continues to grow, right? Mm-hmm. Being educated is the ability to apply knowledge, apply the things that you're learning to your situation. And I can't remember exactly how he said it, but I think that's part of what we have to wrestle with in terms of seminary versus apprenticeship, or what those look like. And I think that too, my seminary education, my Bible college education has been extremely beneficial to me in terms of teaching and in terms of biblical knowledge and biblical literacy and those kinds of things. It wasn't particularly helpful, if I'm going to be honest, in terms of how to lead people, how to administrate a department if you're a department head in a church, how to build a team, how to, and so, but I don't think it was an either or. I think it's both and. I had to have mentors who were bringing me along and showing me how to lead people and investing in my abilities in that way, alongside the Bible education that I received in school. So I don't think it's an either or kind of thing. Is there an environment where both can happen? I think so, but I don't think that exists in every place. And so especially in a rural setting where if you're a single solo pastor, you're not going to have the time or resources to provide a seminary education for someone, that doesn't mean you can't mentor them as a leader, as a pastor, as a shepherd. But maybe it's a both and kind of thing. And you have to assess that. It depends on what that person's calling is, what they feel God's leading them toward. And we have to be sensitive to that as leaders too, and try our best to guide the people that God's placed under us in the direction that would be best for them to accomplish what God's calling them to.
Well, that's a great point, because what's best for them might not be to be on staff at my church.
Yeah.
Or to, hey, I've raised them up and I'm developing them, and the best thing for them might not be that they spend the rest of their life in ministry in this church. And that's the thing that's challenging for us, because pastors are managing what we've got. We're trying to raise up, we're trying to develop, we're trying to grow, we're trying to reach lost people. And we see the need. We see, man, I need people, and so when we raise up and develop somebody and they leave and they go somewhere else, that's painful in the short term. But I've had to remind myself of this over the years. Like, what if the greatest thing I ever do in ministry is raise up somebody who becomes the next Billy Graham, or raise up somebody who goes and pastors and plants an incredible church? How much of a kingdom disservice would that have been if I would have been selfish and kept them and said, no, I need you to run this department for me, when their kingdom potential was so much greater.
Yeah.
And so that's where, as leaders, it's dangerous, because we might lose people we raise up, but but it's more dangerous if we're not raising people up, and it's worse for the kingdom, and it's worse for us ultimately. So I think we just have to have that mindset that, hey, we're gonna look for the kingdom win first, rather than just what is best for our church in this context.
Yeah. I grew up in a pretty small church. And even still, like the church where I grew up it's a small town, it's a smaller church, the attendance, I don't, 150 was a huge Sunday for us, right? That kind of thing. And still it's hovers right around 100 people. Right? It's just that it's never really gone past that plateau. Part of that is the population of the city, and part of, anyway, all of that to say, I can think just in my generation, and I've been gone from there for a long time, so I'm not sure past this, but just from my generation, like I think of guys that were 5 years older and younger, so that 10 years around my age. Just off the top of my head, we had a youth group of about 40 kids, and out of those 40 kids, I can think right now off the top of my head of 10 or 11 guys and girls who are in ministry today, who are pastoring churches, who are missionaries, who are leading in capacities in other places. If our church hadn't had a heart to release people, if my church had, and we celebrated it. It wasn't like it was like, they were sad to see us go, but we celebrated the fact that God was raising up and calling people to go other places. And if we don't have that kind of culture that's willing to release people, then God, I don't believe God will trust us with people with high kingdom capacity, because we're going to try to hoard those resources for ourselves rather than having a mindset that says, hey, we can have a much greater impact than just what, our little corner of
our village, our hamlet,
That segues really nicely into the full circle sort of closing approach to this topic. But before I ride that segue, I just wanted to say, because this has been bouncing around in my head, my favorite Gerald Brooks quote from whenever he was here was he was talking about the motivation for education, and he said, "There is no future in dumb." And
that is true. And wiser words have never been spoken.
That was fun. Okay, so we're talking about releasing people.
You had the perfect segue.
And I didn't take it.
And you blew it because you wanted to mention the Gerald Brooks quote, but that's okay. Friend of the podcast, Gerald Brooks.
Yeah, friend of the podcast, by the way. Okay, so you're releasing people out, right? So let's talk about, how do you know when it's time to retool? And so you can think of this a couple ways. Say the church grows, the vision grows, and it doesn't look like it did look 10 years ago, but you still have some of the same people serving who were serving 10 years ago. And maybe let's say that some of the people who were serving 10 years ago have also grown and matured to the point where maybe they no longer have the capacity to operate in the role that they were before. So let's just assume there's a retooling process, and you can push back on that if you don't think that there is, but let's assume that there is. How do you have those conversations with people, and how do you know when it's time to swap in somebody else, and what would you do with the person who was previously occupying that role?
Those are hard conversations to have. And I would say, in my experience, it's one of the top reasons a lot of churches stagnate, is because a senior leader doesn't want to have those conversations, because they stink. It stinks to talk to somebody and tell them you're not as valuable to the organization in this role as you used to be. But that happens all the time, whether it's a nursery coordinator who is bitter and angry and runs off the parents, like, okay, you're not going to get any kids in your church if none of the parents can come to church because the nursery coordinator, but it's just necessary. And so I think one of the key things when having that conversation is to always have the backdrop of what the church needs. Hey, I know you love our church. You've been part of this church a long time, and I am so grateful for the way you've served it, man. And think of all that's happened. We appreciate that. And I know you would never want to hurt the church, but one of the things I see is that maybe you're not as effective in this as you used to be. And I think there's still some real ways you could help the church, but I think I think if we moved you into a different role, that would really be beneficial, and it'd give the this ministry an opportunity to grow, because I know you love it and I know you're for it, and then you got to give them some time, and I think you can't just make the decision. You got to have a conversation about it and go, hey, let's shift this, and I think once you do, people can come around. But I think, man, initially their first response, because I've had this conversation with staff, with leaders in our church. Their initial response is, you don't need me. You think I'm not valuable. You don't think I'm important. And it's like, no, you've got to combat that. So, and that takes time, because in the moment, it doesn't matter what you say. What they're hearing is, you don't want me on this team. And so you've got to affirm that. You've got to come back and support. You've got to come back and remind them and celebrate them, and, that kind of thing. So it's hard. It's really hard. And I don't mind hard conversations, but I still hate those conversations. So I think you just got to lean into it. And like I said, I think you keep reminding them how much they love the organization, how much they love the department, how much they love, the people they're serving. And one of the most loving things they can do is to move into a different role. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And Mel's right. Some of those conversations are absolutely unavoidable. It's going to happen, and it has to happen. I mean, if your church is not growing and changing, and you're not having those kinds of conversations, well, then you have to ask, well, why aren't we facing decisions about what's the next season look like? I mean, why are we seemingly stuck in this season? And then too, I would say, like I said, some of those conversations are inevitable, but I think you can create a culture that limits the numbers of those conversations you have to have. I know it's kind of cliche at this point, but it's true. Like, leaders raise up their replacement. Like, if you're training your replacement, well, then if you've trained a replacement for yourself, right? If you've developed a leader behind you that you can hand that thing to, well, then there's no need to have a conversation about this isn't the role you should be in any longer, because that leader is already looking for the next thing. But if you've got a leader in a position that isn't raising up people behind them and isn't asking questions about what does my next season of leadership look like, what is it that God, then that's a problem in and of itself that's going to create that difficult conversation. So if you can create a culture that is forward-thinking, forward-looking, that is developing leaders, then you can not eliminate those conversations, but you can mitigate the numbers of those conversations you have to have. I think that's one of the things, honestly, and that's one of the things that we do well at the Summit. It's one of the things that Mel does well as a leader, is that I don't think we have to have a ton of those kinds of conversations, because we are always looking at the next season. We are always talking about bringing up the people that are behind us. And if we're not doing that, then we're going to stagnate. It's inevitable. It just will happen.
Well, and this is not going to be a popular statement. One of the reasons pastors struggle with that is because they've stagnated, and so it's better if you have a culture where people recognize they need to make a change than having to have the conversation. But that's true of pastors as well. If you're the senior leader of your organization, and maybe you've been there too long, but you don't recognize you've been there too long, and you've got a culture where nobody can say, "Hey, pastor, maybe you need to look at what's next." Not in a hateful way, but in the same way I was just saying, hey, you love this organization. You love this church. You've spent your life building it, but you would never want to hurt it, but now you're kind of hurting it. And so that's hard, because a lot of pastors are in that position. So it's hard to facilitate those kind of conversations because we're unwilling to have those ourselves. So, yeah.
And a lot of times, I mean, as a leader, we fail to bring up somebody behind us, because we're afraid that we'll be irrelevant if we do. And in my experience, that's because we have a lack of vision about the future. We're just trying to maintain a status quo rather than grow into the next season.
When you are bringing up someone to replace you, what is a tolerable level of decrease in excellence? Because even if you train that person yourself, they haven't been doing it. They haven't been preaching 3 sermons a weekend for the last 20 years. They haven't been leading worship for 20 years. Like they haven't been actively doing the same thing. So there's probably going to be a drop. I mean, so how, like, well, when you measure that, well, I guess maybe that's a blanket statement, but
it
depends on how good the leader who is
often
being
there will
replaced.
Be a drop. Yeah. So friend of the show, Carrie Newhoff, says that if they can do it half as good as you with upside, give it to them.
Huh. That's cool.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, and he talks about that. I think the old way of thinking was 80%. If they're 80% as good as you, then it's time to give it to them. But he says 50% with upside. And I think that's critical. Like if 50% is their cap, well, you don't hand it to them, right? But if 50% with upside, hand it off, give it to them.
That's great.
Yeah, and I would suggest that as well. And I think there's some areas that are easier to do that than others. Especially behind the scenes stuff. It's easy to do that. You've got to make some decisions when it comes to platform stuff and what you're doing on a weekend or what you're doing that's going to be very visual. If somebody's producing graphics for you and things like that, that's where maybe it won't be 50, but the principle's still true, I believe. So that's something I would definitely say, hey, sacrifice some of your excellence for the chance to develop somebody.
Yeah.
That's really good. We've covered the full circle of sort of team building and leadership development all the way to the part of retiring leaders and retiring people. And so that's been good. Do you guys have any closing thoughts that you'd like to add?
I'm glad that we closed the circle. You don't have to go to any other source.
Circle.
Yeah, you don't have to go to any other source for develelment or for
nature abhors a vacuum. I'm glad we didn't leave one.
We got it.
Hey everyone, don't forget to rate and review this podcast wherever you listen to it, and also subscribe at summitpodcasts.church /subscribe. Again, that is your one-stop shop for all of the podcast content we create here at Summit Church. Thank you for listening to the Back40 Leadership Podcast, and we will see you in the next episode.